On the morning of April 17th, a small unannounced Qatari delegation touched down at Ottawa's Macdonald-Cartier International Airport. There was no press release and no honor guard. Only 3 black vehicles, a discreet RCMP escort, and a motorcade that moved swiftly to a downtown meeting room. Inside that room sat the Qatari Minister of State for Energy Affairs, the CEO of Qatar Energy, and top officials from the Qatar Investment Authority, which manages over $500 billion in state assets. They were met by Canada's Minister of Natural Resources, senior staff from Global Affairs, and, in a 40-minute session absent from any public schedule, the Prime Minister himself. 3 days later, on April 20th, a joint statement appeared simultaneously on both nations' websites. It was a brief, dry announcement of a comprehensive framework for infrastructure cooperation. But beneath the diplomatic phrasing lies a reality that will be studied for a decade. This is not a memorandum of understanding. It is a $15 to $20 billion commitment to integrate Qatar's energy strategy directly into Canada's Pacific infrastructure by 2030. To understand why this move signals a seismic shift in global power, we have to look back to February 28th. Before the conflict, Qatar was the world's benchmark LNG supplier, with a massive production complex at Ras Laffan and an expansion plan targeting 140 million tons of output per year. But that entire commercial identity and its reliability for partners from Tokyo to Berlin rested on one assumption: that Qatari tankers could move through the Strait of Hormuz. That assumption failed 7 weeks ago when the strait was mined and blockaded. Today, the world's largest gas exporter is no longer just sell a commodity. It is desperate for a new, secure geography. That is why they are in Ottawa. That detail tells you exactly how deeply the Gulf's strategic alignment with Washington is currently fracturing. The Ottawa Agreement is a masterclass in reading the room of a collapsing security architecture. To understand why Qatar, a nation whose wealth is fundamentally tethered to the Persian Gulf, is now effectively colonizing Canadian energy infrastructure, you have to look at the numbers. On March 18th, a strike on the Ras Laffan complex shaved 17% off Qatar's total LNG production capacity. Analysts estimate that the resulting damage will take 3 to 5 years to repair. That is not a temporary setback. That is the dissolution of a supply-side monopoly. Here is what that detail tells you. Qatar is no longer operating under the assumption that it can fulfill its global obligations from its own shores. By pivoting to Canada, Doha is engaging in a rapid high-stakes hedge against its own geography. Consider the nature of the framework signed on April 20th. It includes a reported $15 to $20 billion capital commitment, one of the largest single-country foreign direct investments in Canadian history. This isn't just about building pipelines. It is about buying geopolitical distance. In the words of an energy analyst close to the negotiation, Qatar is not buying gas capacity. They are buying an export insurance policy that cannot be mined, blockaded, or held hostage by an IRGC fast attack boat. The evidence of this shift is visible in the data. While global LNG spot prices surged by over 140% following the blockade, Canadian projects like LNG Canada at Kitimat suddenly transformed from regional industrial plays into the only viable secure exit for the world's most powerful energy players. The strategy is clear. If the Persian Gulf is a contested maritime battle space, the Pacific coast of North America is the new safe harbor. And Qatar is not acting alone. The United Arab Emirates, through ADOC and Mubadala, is currently in what sources describe as substantive, advanced discussions regarding equity participation in similar Canadian infrastructure. When a state-owned enterprise like the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company, ADNOC, begins auditing the books of Canadian pipelines, it confirms a brutal reality for Washington. The Gulf states have concluded that their long-term economic survival requires a departure from the 50-year-old bargain of American guaranteed freedom of navigation. We are watching a fundamental rerouting of the global energy supply chain. The question that remains, and the one that will dictate the next 12 months of this conflict, is whether the White House will attempt to leverage trade policy to block these Gulf capital inflows into Canada, effectively forcing these nations back into a failing security model, or whether they will allow this energy sovereignty pivot to proceed potentially signaling the final, quiet retirement of the post-Cold War security architecture in the Gulf. The Ottawa-Doha framework is not merely a commercial transaction. It is a decisive acknowledgement that the security for energy bargain that defined the post-WI era has reached its terminal point. For Canada, this transition marks the end of its traditional posture as a passive energy supplier and the beginning of its role as a strategic anchor for states seeking to exit the high-risk zones of the Persian Gulf. By integrating Qatari capital and operational expertise into Pacific export terminals like Kitimat and Cedar LNG, Ottawa is effectively institutionalizing a new reality. Energy security is no longer about proximity to the source, but about control over the transit geography. For the key actors, the implications are immediate. Europe, still reeling from the structural loss of Russian gas, finds its supply stability now partially contingent on Canadian Pacific exports, a logistical pivot that would have been unthinkable 2 years ago. India, which relied heavily on Qatari shipments, is now navigating a transition where its energy security is tied to the efficiency of Canadian infrastructure and the diplomatic strength of the North American corridor. For Washington, the strategic cost is stark. Every dollar of Gulf capital invested in a Canadian pipeline is a dollar exiting the American financial orbit and, more importantly, a vote of no confidence in the U.S. Navy's ability to keep the Strait of Hormuz open. The next move is inevitable. As Qatar breaks the seal, the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia are already calculating their own exit strategies from the Gulf's maritime bottleneck. We expect to see copycat frameworks emerging by the third quarter of 2026, partnerships that pair Gulf sovereign wealth with Canadian regulatory acceleration. The White House will face an acute dilemma: either facilitate a new multipolar energy security framework that includes Canada as a central pillar, or risk accelerating a permanent fracture in the alliance system by attempting to coerce partners who have already decided that the era of relying on a single, vulnerable choke point is over. The core insight here is that when a superpower loses the ability to guarantee the trade routes of its allies, those allies stop asking for permission and start building their own safety nets. The age of the single American-led maritime security umbrella is being replaced by a fragmented, regionalized map of safe energy geography. The infrastructure now breaking ground on the Pacific coast is not just building capacity. It is building the infrastructure of a world where Washington is no longer the sole arbiter of global energy flow. The Gulf is not just pivoting, it is departing, and the silence of the Canadian-Qatari announcement is the sound of a new, harder, and far more transactional era beginning.